Welcome to What If Geography. We are back after, full disclosure, Hunter and I are still sitting here in the same day, just about 5 minutes later. Now we're recording part 2 of this episode. For you, it's a whole extra week, though.
That's right.
You're living in the future. You're future people. We are not. We're past people. So maybe by the time you're listening to this, housing's been solved. You know. Maybe
then we'll have to come up with another episode. That's right.
I would be willing to make that trade.
That would be a great problem to have.
Yeah. So we are today we're going to continue our conversation on what if housing wasn't so expensive, primarily within the United States, although I do think that there are parallels that can be brought into a lot of different countries that are suffering from the same issue. But we're heavily US focused here. My name is Jeff Gibson. I am one of the co-hosts of this podcast, and I do things on YouTube, which we'll get to at the end. I'm just going to pass it over to you, Hunter.
Thanks, Jeff. I'm Hunter Shoby. I'm a professor of geography at Portland State University. I teach a variety of classes that deal with urban and cultural and economic things there. I'm co-author of a couple books, including Portlandness, a cultural atlas, and Upper Left Cities, a cultural atlas of San Francisco, Portland, and Seattle. And of course, co-host of this podcast.
Yeah. And oh boy, this has been a fun topic, I think, for the two of us. Hunter and I are very interested in cities at large. I would say, and a lot of the topics we talk about in this podcast, cities come into play here and there, some more than most. I think this is our first episode where we're really this is primarily a city, focused conversations, right? So, we I guess we'll do just a really quick recap because we have a heady episode today. We talked a lot about the history of sort of housing laws, right? So we sort of almost went through the decades, starting in really 1800 up to 2007, just talking about sort of how policies and laws have gotten us to where we are today. And so we talked about the first tenement laws, passed in New York City. We talked a lot about redlining and sort of the rise of the suburbs and the GI Bill's impact and sort of World War II's impact. I think the primary thing I guess, first of all, we're not going to go through all this history again. It's a fascinating
but check
subject.
It out if you're interested,
yeah.
If you haven't heard it already.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think in theory, this episode can stand alone. I don't think people necessarily need to listen to part 1.
Right. That's right.
But episode 1 provides a lot of context again. And I said this a lot in last week for you, that where we're at today is a confluence of multiple years and decades of policies and laws that sort of stack on top of each other to create this current situation of housing being so expensive. So I do think it provides a lot of really great context for where we're at for today's episode. And is there anything else we should really talk about in sort of a recap, Hunter? Any big points
I think you hit a lot of the main things, and we talked about how it was a really rural country to begin with in terms of, most people were farmers in the 1800s, but by 1920, I don't think this is a statistic we gave last time, but I'm seeing that by 1920, the United States becomes over half urban. So that's the point where the scale sort of tips. And the experience of most people in the country is that of an urban setting than instead of a rural setting. Incidentally, for globally, that moment happens 1999, 2000. So that's, the globe's a big place. That's smushing together lots of different things. But in the United States, that's something that is by 1920, cities have become the sort of most common experience for people.
Right. And a lot plays into that, right? So industrialization sort of, and we've talked about this a lot. And I would say this is probably one of our most common themes, is that people move largely for economic reasons, right? They're moving for some perceived economic advantage.
Yeah, certainly people move to escape situations in which they're being persecuted for various things. But if
Hmm.
we look at just the numbers, there are a lot of people who are moving to seek better economic opportunity.
Right. And so with that, I think let's just go ahead and dive into our episode today, which is let's talk, let's kind of talk about how we got to where we're at today. And I think the first thing I want to sort of talk about is really just how housing works. And so I think there's a lot of misconceptions around housing works. I'm not a housing expert necessarily. I am a city planner, so that sort of goes hand in hand with the trade a little bit. And so I think there's a few different points I want to hit on. And so the first is, and we've talked a lot about this already. Again, if you listen to the first episode, we talked a lot about rent control. And so I think talking a little bit about rent control is sort of where I want to start off. And so I guess broadly, let's just define it, right? And actually, Hunter, what do you know about rent control?
Well, I know that it's a mechanism for ensuring that people of different economic classes have the opportunity to live in cities. And, to make a city run, you need people who are taking all kinds of different jobs. And so people need to be able to live in the city, ideally be able to live close to their jobs, which isn't always the case. And so rent control is a way of protecting people with low incomes, and giving them the ability to live in a place that they might otherwise be priced out of.
Exactly. Yeah, it's that exact concept. It's and just to attach a number to it, it's let's say 20 years ago you moved to your city and you had an apartment and it was listed at $500 a month, and now it's 20 years later and now you're paying, let's say, $750 a month. That's not market conditions, right? That I would argue in any city in the United States, certainly, regardless of where you are, that apartment would be multiple times more expensive today. But because there are rent control laws, it was probably only able to increase by 1 or 2% each year or something like that, or attached to the cost of living or something like that, right? There's various mechanisms in play that sort of enable, and rent control is sort of a broad-based term to what's sort of a catch-all that catches a lot of these different mechanisms. But
yeah, I mentioned low income, but it really could be a mechanism for middle income people as well, to make sure that there's a way of covering expenses and continuing to live in a place. And sometimes it's people who've been living in a place for generations, and to ensure that should, that they can maintain their residence.
Yeah. And so I guess the reason why I wanted to bring it up, especially within this context of how housing works, is that it's often, so rent control is often brought up as a solution to the current housing affordability issues. And, I would argue it absolutely is a solution. I don't think, again, you're never going to get out of me a, one size fits all solution. There's, this is the cure all that's going to magically make everything better. The world just doesn't work that way. I do believe that rent control is something that should be factored in more. However, it's a very difficult conversation for a country like the United States, which is historically, even under, let's say, more liberal presidents and governments, still leaned more towards deregulatory efforts, right? So as a country, we are constantly figuring out how we can enable private, and we talked a lot about this in episode 1, how can we enable private investment to have sort of a market satisfy the demand rather than the federal government. And one of the ways that has been enabled is by rolling back a lot of rent control laws and policies that really enabled a lot of people to stay where they were for large parts of their existence, certainly dating back to World War II, right? There's also this argument, and this is really popular within my field, which is city planning, which I would argue is a very much more left-leaning profession overall. I don't think that's probably a surprise to most people. However, for this particular topic, I think most city planners do not believe in rent control, which is very interesting to me. And I think the logic goes, and there's a lot of people who economists, I would say, who talk about okay, well, if you have rent control, you're now disincentivizing the market from providing more housing, right? So the logic being, well, if the city of Seattle, caps rents at 5% a year, this developer who, has shareholders that needs to make X amount of profits per year, are they going to want to invest, $10 million, $20 million, however much it costs to build, an apartment building in Seattle if they're capped at how much they can make?
And this just highlights the degree to which private property is held as this really sort of high value in the United States,
exactly,
compared to a lot of other places. And the assumption is that, well, if private industry is not going to build it, we won't have any homes. Whereas, the government can be involved in building homes, and in a lot of places, that's what happens. But the assumption here is that we have to do something to incentivize private industry to provide homes. And, the many narratives of the United States, which are somewhat mythical in many ways, but the idea of the American dream, which has been, heavily critiqued, of course, but the idea at its core, is home ownership in a lot of ways. So that's been part of the narrative of the United States for a while. That doesn't mean that it's defines it for everybody, but that's the way that the United States kind of gets talked about a lot of times, I think.
Right. Yeah. So and that frames so much. I mean, that concept frames so much about how we look at something as simple as multifamily housing or apartments or whatever you want to call them, right? And we're going to launch into a discussion on single family housing here in a few minutes, but like that, just that idea that has had a monumental impact on where we're at today. But just going back to rent control for just one more minute, I think, again, there's that city planners often don't like it because they think it disincentivizes the market. And maybe there's some aspect of that that's true. I don't know. I'm not an economist. However, I would say that rent control is a really, relatively quick fix to help a lot of people. Whereas if you are leaning on, well, we just need to build more housing, deregulate everything, build more housing, that's a longer term fix, right? So there's a housing lag time. If you're saying that your city needs, 50,000 new units of housing today, while that's a great statistic to have, and a lot of cities do need a lot of housing today, that amount of housing isn't going to come online for years. You could get all of those housing started today, and you're still looking at, probably 4 or 5 years down the road before those are actually, functioning in the market. So I guess my point being here is that rent control, I think, does have a place within sort of our current how housing works today, to help people out who are actively being displaced, and helping to ensure the affordability of neighborhoods and apartments and all this fun stuff continues to exist and function. And this sort of leads to sort of the next thing I want to talk about, which was the housing filter, right? So again, I think, we're here in Portland, and I often bring that up. And we talk a lot about, I think broadly within this sphere, we talk a lot about, all these new apartments that are popping up. And I think generally people are like, well, there's an apartment, going up on, whatever street, whatever cross street. And this happens a lot in Portland. And it's a luxury apartment. And so people sort of roll their eyes and they're like, well, that's not really going to help anybody. It's, $2,000 a month. However, there's this theory, this housing theory called the housing filter, which is just basically how housing works is, typically things start in the luxury, right? Again, if you're looking at these corporations and you're working in the private market, they're going for the maximum amount of dollars returned to them, especially because they're fronting so much capital up front, right? These are tens of millions of dollars to build one of these buildings. And so therefore, yeah, they are often luxury oriented. They're often, aimed at a certain demographic. Apartments, certainly, sort of like young, urban, sort of, millennials or Gen Zs would probably be the primary market today for these organizations, 1 bedrooms. And they're expensive, true to their point. However, this all feeds into this housing filter wherein, okay, new construction comes in, it's the most expensive, it's sitting at the top. But that then pushes construction that happened maybe at this point, even in the early 2000s, down the pipeline a little bit, right? So now those buildings that were built 15 or 20 years ago, or maybe even 10 years ago, are, a little bit cheaper. Housing that was built, apartments that were built in the 90s and 80s are now even a little bit cheaper, right? So
Yeah, it's
this
not
is
that
sort
their
of that
rents are
cycle.
going down, but they're comparatively cheaper than the stuff that's being built maybe now.
Right. And so what's being built today, while it's, quote unquote luxury, in 20 years, it is probably very likely, unless there's a big rehab to remodernization project, it probably becomes a little bit cheaper. And again, this is just how housing sort of works, right? And so this works for broadly most multifamily housing. This doesn't work quite as well with single family housing. And so we're going to talk about that. Well, actually, there's one more thing I wanted to talk about. Again, just respect how housing works. So, and this will directly feed into our conversation. And that is this aspect of, so we talked about rent control, we talked about multifamily housing. We're going to talk about single family housing in a second. There is this whole concept sort of in between these two things, of housing that we don't really talk about at all in this country. In fact, the way that we usually frame it within my field is the quote unquote missing middle housing. And this would be housing that is of varying degrees more dense, but also not, an apartment building. So if you go to, I think Philadelphia has the most of this of any city. But this would be your sort of row houses, your townhouses. So if you're looking at a building, you sort of look up and down the street, let's say 2-story buildings. They're all connected, but there's nobody on top of them necessarily. And it's sort of like a row house that sort of has a front door, it has its back, and it's like, fairly dense for what it is. They're often a little bit cheaper.
Not high rise density, but more dense than single family homes on sort of big lots.
Yeah, things are still connected to each other. Duplexes, triplexes, quadplexes. These were all very common in the early part of the 1900s in the U.S. to be built, and they've since gone away, right? And so everything here is just sort of, the lack of missing middle housing plays into this, right? Because if you have people living in apartments and renting, and you have this idea, and our functional system is to get people into houses because that's an investment vehicle for them. It's a societal urge, desire. You're asking them to jump an incredibly big gap between renting and owning a single family house, which we are going to talk about in just 2 more minutes, because we're going to run through some ads right now because it's going to get a lot.
We'll be right back.
Welcome back. We're just going to jump right back into it for the interest of time. So we just left off talking broadly about how housing worked, and we talked about missing middle housing, and now we're going to start talking about single family housing. And so I think Hunter, we've already kind of talked a lot about it, but I'm going to ask you to just sort of define what a single family house is.
Well, I mean, a single family house is one that doesn't share walls with another property, right? It's exactly. One that's intended to be for one family, that isn't parsed out into like a duplex or a triplex or a quad or something like that. Would be something a little bit different. It's something that stands alone on its own lot. And a lot of this emerges as the sort of really popular option from World War II, as we get an increased amount of suburbanization and this idea that people want their own home. And it's a house, and it's not connected to anybody else.
Exactly. Yeah. So that's exactly what single family housing is. It is a single family, or is a single house that is simply not connected to another form of housing. So as soon as you do make that connection, then it becomes something else. And, and the reason why we're making such a large distinction here between single family housing and other kinds of housing is because, as it turns out, we as almost a nation, as a country, aside from some very few cities, have basically made single family housing the default of housing construction. And this all goes down to what I promised you all last week, a large conversation in zoning. So let's talk a little bit about zoning. We're going to talk a little bit about single family zoning mostly, but just to give you a broad overview of sort of what zoning was intended to do. And Hunter talked a little bit about this, gave you a little bit of a hint at what we were going to talk about today. Zoning was a concept, an idea that was sort of started to implement sort of in the early part of the 1900s as a way to separate industry from where people lived. Because as it turns out, that's a really bad idea to have those two so intermingled. Not that there can't be some mingling, which we'll talk about in a little bit, but actually, Hunter, why would that be such a terrible idea? Or why was that such a terrible idea?
Well, I mean, if you track back a little bit further, initially that's tenement housing was often built near factories so people could live really close to where they worked, and there was an advantage to that. One of the things we talked about in the last episode was the potential for fire.
Mm-hmm.
There's pollution, there's all kinds of industrial noise, quality of life, it's sometimes called, that gets compromised when you have a factory right next to where people live.
Right.
And so zoning, part of it is that, we can talk more about that, but in practice, zoning also has been a way of segregating different people, groups of
exactly.
people.
Yeah. So I think going back to your first point, yeah. So like zoning was originally implemented as a way to, and if you look at a factory today, it's likely not someplace that you would want to live near. But factories today are a lot better than factories 100 years ago. They were far more pollutant. They were far more dangerous, far more prone to fires, far more prone to pollution and industrial waste, all this kind of stuff. And so that really was what zoning was originally intended to sort of solve, was this bigger issue of more public health than anything else, right? How do you...
just let me interject this idea right now that, if we think about the period of globalization that started in, let's say, the 1970s, another thing that's changed is a lot of factories that we're talking about that pollute, that make a lot of noise, that are places that you wouldn't want to live near, increasingly are being leased by companies in the United States and other parts of the world, right? This idea of exporting manufacturing to other parts of the world. So that's another part of, we talked a little bit about deindustrialization in our last episode, the process by which a part of the city that used to be heavily industrial becomes less industrial or not industrial anymore. And part of that is industry going to other parts of the city or the region. And part of it is industry moving to other countries altogether.
Right. And exporting sort of the negative externalities of whatever that is. Right?
That's right. That's right.
But yeah, zoning. So yeah, that was the original intention of zoning. As Hunter alluded to, it often then starts to be used more as a hammer to force various ideas of segregation, or if not even segregation based on sort of racial means, certainly a segregating of an economic segregation, right? And so this is where we get into this concept of single family zoning. This is, so if you look at your city's whatever land use plan, comprehensive plan is normally what it would be called, but varying degrees. Your city almost absolutely has zoned out its where residential of varying density is allowed to go. Very few places allow basically any kind of residential development to happen anywhere. So up until very recently, Portland was zoned about 70% of all of its land for single family residences, which means that only single family homes can be built within large swaths of your city. Cleveland, Houston. Well, actually, Houston's not a good example. We're not going to talk about Houston, but it's very different. But let's say Dallas, Austin, Jacksonville, Mississippi. All of these cities have very similar land use zoning laws that have precluded any sort of other type of residential housing within most of its land. And I have a quote here from Sonia Hertz. She's a professor of landscape architecture. She did a little bit of research on how we compare with this particular sort of development pattern and laws and policies to other countries. And this is direct quote from her. So, quote, I could find no evidence in other countries that this particular form, the detached single family home, is routinely, as in the United States, considered to be so incompatible with all other types of urbanization as to warrant a legally defined district all on its own, a district where all other major land uses and building types are directly outlawed. And that's the case, right? It's when you have a single family zone within your city, you can't build a duplex, you can't build a triplex, you can't build an apartment building. So this is now, for lack of a better term, detached from what zoning laws were originally sort of intended for, which was just to get residential away from industry, right? So that was very high.
And part of that, part of the motivation for that is protecting residential property values as well. So it's not only sort of quality of life thing, but a lot of it was driven by the idea that your property is worth more and it's going to maintain its value if it's not located in next to industry or something like that. So I have a couple examples of early zoning that cities have adopted. The earliest thing that I could find about some kind of city zoning was San Francisco in 1885, which banned public laundries in many areas as a way to exclude Chinese people, who were often, that was one of the main businesses that was being run in San Francisco at the time. This law was incidentally struck down by the Supreme Court a year later. So this, initial foray into zoning as a means of ensuring some kind of segregation was struck down. I think the first evidence I see of something that lasted a little bit longer was zoning that was adopted in Los Angeles in the first decade of the 1900s. Again, as a way to protect residential property values in the face of industrial operations. This gets adopted by many cities and then starts to become very exclusionary based on race. New York City has its first zoning regulations in 1916. And the reason that's so important is because it becomes a template for the rest of the country in many ways.
Right. As New York City, like if we go back to, not to go back into last week's episode too much, but I think maybe one thing we didn't hit on quite enough is that New York City, certainly for the 1800s and early and up until maybe like the middle part of the 1900s, really set the tone for what housing law and policies were going to look like.
Not to mention transportation, just to add that on there.
Yeah.
But a lot of times, earlier in the development of the country, New York set the standard.
Right. Yeah. And so I think you hit on something briefly, which was, single family zonings, were enacted in part to maintain value within sort of communities and homes and, all this kind of stuff. And this is really a prime. So we're going to start talking about NIMBYs. And so for those of you who have never heard the term, it's quite common these days, so I'd be surprised if you haven't. But NIMBY is it's an acronym. It stands for Not in My Backyard, and it's a concept that has existed for well before now. Though I do think we're sort of hitting a peak NIMBY sort of moment where it's being talked a lot more about. But this idea of maintaining value in one's home is really sort of one of the big issues that this NIMBY class people really use to fight back against any and all measures to roll back any sort of single family zoning, right? So the idea that, if, an apartment building is built, down the street from my home, that will then be seen as less desirable because it will be, for any number of reasons, be people who are less well off moving into the neighborhood, or it could be, I've heard people talk about, it's going to bring more traffic to the neighborhood. And meanwhile, this is, again, a lot of these cities, I'm sitting here in Portland, I'm about, 3 miles away from downtown. There's a sea of single family homes around. For all intents and purposes, we should not have this much single family housing this close to a downtown. However, it's been maintained that way. And so therefore, there are still people who want less apartments and less multifamily homes, just to use as an example, or even duplexes and triplexes, which are still seen as negative and still bringing too much density, for the perceived notion that, well, it'll bring more traffic, it'll, need more cars, all this kind of stuff, which will then have a decrease on the viability or the value of the neighborhood. And so we see this play out everywhere, but I think predominantly what's gotten the most sort of spotlight is the San Francisco Bay Area, and probably more specifically the South Bay cities. So that would be like, Mountain View, I think.
Palo Alto, perhaps.
Palo Alto. That's the one that I think I've heard the most about, which is, I guess we can talk about San Francisco a little bit because it is such it's such an overwhelming case of housing.
San Francisco has the highest rents in the United States. I mean, apparently beyond New York City.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And so there's a huge effort within California at large to increase the density and allow more of these, kinds of, multifamily housing and this missing middle kinds of housing. But it's in
our own city of Portland, we've seen changes in the last 10 years plus where things have changed, where suddenly you can put in a duplex or a quad unit or something like that in an area that had previously been zoned exclusively for single family.
So Oregon, the state, was the first state, and this only happened, I think, in 2017, was the first state in the country to mandate that all single-family zoned areas had to allow, if depending on the size of your city, but had to allow at least a duplex as well. If you're a city that's over a certain size, and I don't know the size off the top of my head, you have to allow up to, I think, a sixplex or a garden. It would be called like a garden apartment, where it's, a bunch of apartments sort of around like a little middle area of, planters or grass or what have you. And so Oregon really mandated that, and that sort of has now filtered out into the various cities, right? They had to pass new land use sort of laws that now, again, I think there's this idea from NIMBYs, this NIMBY class of people that, this is, going to demolish, all these historic, quote unquote, historic homes. And, now there's going to be so much density being piled in. It's like, well, yeah, over the next 50 years, maybe. Right. This is, again, going back to what I was talking about, the housing lag time. We're passing these laws now. We're not going to see the impact of them for decades, because housing is a slow moving business. As much as people think that it happens fast, I think if I'm looking back, again, my own experience here in Portland, we had the pre sort of COVID sort of building rush where it seemed like there were so many cranes around the city. We still weren't building enough housing. Right. So single family housing, to some degrees is being chipped away at. So in California is trying to, push its cities. They passed a law that I can't remember exactly what it says, but it's supposed to allow more density at various areas. But then there are still cities such as Palo Alto that, people who live there now live in multi-million-dollar homes, who push back vehemently and, a lot against any sort of densification. And, the common refrain is, well, we're not New York City. We're not New York City. We're not New York City. Thinking that any sort of density is then going to bubble up, and all of a sudden there's going to be a New York City on the plot of Palo Alto, which I think is a funny concept.
Yeah, I mean, that happens at different scales. There are several neighborhoods in Portland that are, some of the residents are telling the same story. It's like, well, this is a neighborhood that we should, this historical preservation sometimes gets trotted out as a reason not to develop areas. And of course, it's value placed on what gets preserved, because everything is historical. It turns out. It happened. It's built in the past. It's history, right? And so, exactly. And certainly, some things may be, some people might argue, well, this has particular value or something like that. But you can't help but think that oftentimes what's behind some of these arguments is that the value they're thinking about is the value of their home more than anything.
Well, absolutely. I think there's so in Portland, again, not to just talk always about Portland, but obviously it's our nearest example. There are entire neighborhoods that basically, get their neighborhood put on the National Register of Historic places, as a way to circumvent laws and ensure that, densification and development can't happen where you can bulldoze a house and build a duplex on it instead. Again, that doesn't happen all that often anyways. But like these neighborhoods will go and they'll claim that, their neighborhood is historic. Sorry, your neighborhood probably isn't actually historic. I mean, aside from the fact that, maybe your buildings were mostly built, 1920 or 1911 or whatever.
That's not that long ago. It turns out the city's only 150 years old. So it's a tough argument to make sometimes when you consider that there were people who were living here for thousands of years before.
Exactly. Yeah. Like for me, my argument is always like, show me what actual like historical event happened within this neighborhood that now designates this entire neighborhood as a historic area. And obviously you would never find that, right? That would be unbelievably hard to. There's very few instances of that happening.
And usually that history is harkening back to a change, right? It's like, well, we're harkening back to when these things were built and there was a massive change in this place, and that's a strange thing to try to want to freeze in time. Part of what makes it historic is that it was addressing a perceived need at the time. And so if that need changes or the needs of society change, why should an area necessarily be drawn with a line around it saying, no, we have to preserve this one little moment in history here.
Right. And for Portland, again, this might apply to a lot of cities, but a lot of that moment comes around when the craftsman style house sort of became, more prevalent. And I love this as a reason for why people want to save a particular neighborhood or not, because if you actually go back and like read sort of some newspaper clippings around sort of when these craftsman style houses were being built, people hated them. People saw them much in the same way that we hear a lot of talk about sort of these modern apartment buildings going up. Oh, they're so ugly. Oh, they all look the same. Oh, XYZ, XYZ, XYZ. And so it's funny to now, again, 100 years later, people thinking it's such a core part of the identity of whatever neighborhood, that it's worth, saving into eternity, right?
When it's like, sometimes these are the same neighborhoods that had racial covenants that really excluded non-white people. And so that's a tough history to want to preserve, I think.
Right. And so I think, I could drone on endlessly about single family zoning and zoning at large.
Not that it doesn't have its place, but you said 70% of this city, for example, and that's probably true of a lot of places.
A lot of cities, yeah.
That's part of feeding into our whole dialogue here about, why are rents high? Well, if there is sort of low density, that contributes to that in part.
Right. And so a lot of this, so let's jump head to our next section, in which you can talk a little bit about the Great Recession and everything. But I think before we even get to the Great Recession, there was a trend that was starting to emerge, starting in, I want to say, maybe early 2000s, and it started really taking off from there. And I think it coincides a lot with sort of the millennial generation sort of getting older and going to college and then, getting jobs and, what have you. And that was this idea of the living in the city becoming popular again. We talked about this last week, but through the 70s, 80s, 90s, there was more of a hollowing out of cities as investment left and sort of the rise of the suburbs and suburbs growing. And so probably this pendulum probably swung the other way, right? All of these millennials, myself being one of them, were raised in sort of suburbs or these very low density areas that weren't dynamic, were kind of boring and bland. And so, cities are interesting. Cities have things to do. Cities have walkability. They have
jobs.
They have jobs. And so what we saw was that, okay, now there's people who want to live in cities again. People want to move to these areas. And so that has had an enormous impact on sort of the affordability of cities, right? So if you go back to the 80s and 90s, and I have some personal sort of history. My uncle moved to Portland when I was just a kid. I think it was 1990. And he bought his house sometime around then as well, within a neighborhood in Portland that today would be $1 million houses. Back then, it wasn't a desirable neighborhood at all. And he bought his house for, I want to say he said $55,000. His house today would easily be, I think, worth over $1 million. He doesn't own it anymore. He sold it a long time ago. Would easily be worth over $1 million today. That's not that long, also, all things considered, for that type of return on investment. So it's really an incredible amount of value add and growth that was sort of enabled by revitalizations of these cities. And so then this started happening in the mid 2000s. And then, well, wouldn't you know it, the Great Recession hits. And with that, well, actually, with that, we're going to jump to some ads.
Okay.
So we're going to do some quick ads. And then we're going to jump into sort of the lasting impacts of the Great Recession on housing affordability. Here we go.
We'll be right back.
Welcome back. We're going to talk a little bit now about the Great Recession and sort of its impact, because, again, all this is feeding into sort of where we're at today. So in 2007, sort of the year that sort of kicked off sort of this the housing market contraction that we sort of felt, so that sort of collapsed into itself through a lot of different things called, I don't know, I heard subprime mortgages being thrown around, and I have no idea what that means. I think a lot of people don't know what that means either. But I think the takeaway here is that the Great Recession caused really a deficit in housing construction. So if you remember, if you did listen to last week, we talked a little bit about this graph where between 1950 and then all the way up to really 2007, really when the Great Recession hit, there was tens of millions of homes being started every single decade. Really a historic amount of highs. In fact, the decade of 2002 to 2009 was the highest one yet. It was almost 15 million housing starts that year or that decade. That's a lot of housing. And then what happened was the Great Recession hit. And then in the 20-teens, so that'd be from 2010 to 2019, that number was almost 1/3, right? So within that decade, there was about almost 7 million, or I guess about half. So almost 7 million houses were started. So a lot fewer homes being built every single year. And there's a reason for this. And it's not that, so typically, if we follow the market advice, right, it's, well, there's a market and therefore the market comes in to save the day and, satisfies the demand and everything sort of evens out. That's sort of like what perfect capitalism, right? It doesn't always work out as cleanly as that. And so when we look at sort of what happened in the Great Recession, what we're sort of missing is that, okay, people are trying to buy homes again after this sort of period of economic decline. People are trying to buy homes again. Their incomes are going up, all this, stuff for certainly a certain population. But housing could never meet the demand again as it was in 2000 to 2009. And that's because, well, when a whole market collapses unto itself for multiple years, as it turns out, the people who are working those jobs need to find jobs elsewhere. And it's probably not going to be in the construction field again because, again, that market collapsed. So what do? They go and they learn how to program and become computer engineers and work at, tech companies, or they go back to school for this or that, and they move off into another field. This happened for millions of construction workers. And so, I have a quote here from somebody. I'm not going to read the direct quote, but the point being here is that, these sort of tradespeople got retrained for new jobs, and they haven't come back. And so there's not even the workforce within this country to hit that same level of construction as we were seeing for the decades previous. And so that is probably, if we were to boil down affordability into a single event, which obviously, would be impossible, but I would say that has still had probably the most lasting immediate impact on today's affordability crisis, above almost anything else. We simply cannot build enough housing. Meanwhile, the population is still growing. People are still moving to the U.S. For all the reasons why they should be moving here. There's a lot of economic benefits to living here, but we're not able to keep up with the demand of housing.
I wanted to backtrack to this idea of the subprime loans for a second, just to
Okay.
sort of clarify that a little bit. So,
Oh,
subprime
great.
mortgage refers to lending to people with lower credit scores than would normally be deemed a safe risk.
Mm,
And so, subprime refers really to the credit scores of people being lended money to, not to the rates themselves. In fact, the interest rates with subprime mortgages are usually higher because the idea is that the risk is more.
there's more
So this
risk.
ties into, if there are a lot of mortgages being made available, then there's lots of demand for housing, and that this was really high, as you said, up until 2007, 8, 9, when 2008 and 9, when the housing market sort of collapsed based
Hmm.
on some of this subprime mortgage situation.
Interesting. Yeah. So, man, I have a bone to pick with credit scores in general. That we're not going to get into this
That's
episode.
another episode,
That's
I
a
think.
whole
What if there
other
were no
episode.
credit scores would be an interesting episode. Yeah.
Yeah, it would absolutely. Because again, that's not to dive too much into it, but it's basically a private entity that sort of controls a lot of how our society functions, right?
Mm-hmm.
Through something like this, where it's subprime mortgages were a thing apparently that maybe gave people houses that were riskier. People didn't have income to support it. I don't know. But I think it all, again, I think going back to sort of um, that event in particular, that has contributed a overwhelming amount of the impacts that we're seeing today. But there's one other thing that I want to talk about, and that
What's it?
is rent in general. So we talked broadly about single family housing. We talked about housing affordability broadly, right? We can all attest to the fact that if you wanted to buy a home in the last 10 years, well, the best time to have done that was probably in 2011, because it's not gotten easier since then. But rent has seen a disproportionate amount of gains previous to any other period that people have been renting homes. And so certainly since the pandemic started, but I would argue even before that, it was not uncommon to see, hear about, rents going up, 10%, 15%, 50%, 100% wasn't even uncommon. Maybe not dominant, but, I've definitely heard of apartments, saying that your rent is now going to be double. And again, if we track back to sort of rent control, when we're faced with these kinds of market conditions, yeah, maybe rent control does have a place to play here, to prevent these kinds of outright exploitative practices. But there's a really interesting article that came out. What was this? This was October 15th, 2022 from ProPublica. And it was about this company. It's called RealPage, and they created a software called YieldStar that helps landlords set prices based on market conditions around the entire country. It's sort of an algorithmic thing. Obviously, that's a hot topic. Within sort of tech industries, everything's run by an algorithm. What has happened is that there's now a lawsuit targeting this company, as well as a number of investment companies that own hundreds of thousands or millions of apartments across the country, that is saying that this software has essentially allowed apartment companies to collude on a price fixing level. Which
is a violation of federal law.
Which is a violation of federal law, right? Competitors can't work together to keep their prices high, or whatever. They can't price fix. They can't work together. They're supposed to be competing with each other.
That's a cartel, and that's not supposed to be how capitalism works, right? So
exactly.
If you have a way of effectively fixing rent prices above competitive levels and allowing landlords that are supposed to be in competition with one another to coordinate pricing, in effect forming a cartel, that's the lawsuit that has been brought against the company is contending that this is a violation of federal law.
Right. And I think, if we look at price fixing at large, I think generally what we would think of, historically as, these, businessmen getting together in a meeting and sort of like, setting this, we're only going to charge, we're not going to charge less than, $5 per whatever, per unit of, gasoline. I don't know. Probably a bad example because that is
widgets or whatever. Yeah.
But anyways, like that idea that there's like a shady business meeting, with all these like executives of these companies. And I think what we're looking at with this case is that, well, these people haven't ever really directly talked to each other, but they're all using this same software, this Yield Star, software which then sets, based on sort of, whatever algorithm magic that happens in there, that sets prices across the board for all of these companies that, again, control a disproportionate amount of the units available on the market. And so they don't necessarily have to talk to each other directly for it to still be price fixing, including, because if this algorithm and this software is going to keep pushing up rents based on what it says can work, no longer are these companies working in a vacuum where they have to assume that their competition isn't going to be as bold in raising rents. Now they can sort of say, well, yeah, the algorithm's saying it for us, it's saying it for them, so let's all do it in general. And there's a quote in here from this article, and it's from Andrew Bowen, who is a RealPage executive. So that's the company that owns this. It's, quote, "As a property manager, very few of us would be willing to actually raise rents double digits within a single month by doing it manually." And so that's just alluding to the fact that this software is allowing them to do things that they otherwise wouldn't have been able to for fear of pricing themselves out of the market, which is obviously a big part of what price fixing is, right? You don't want to price yourself out. Otherwise, you run the risk of going out of business, right? If all of a sudden, apartments in your city cost $1,000 a month, wholesale, let's say that, and another one comes online and it's offering the same amenities and it's $1,500 a month. Well, how many people are really going to move into that apartment, provided that there's not, unbelievable amount of demand. But then if there was, then everybody else would have gone up based on that demand. And so this is happening around the country. And, not every apartment management company uses this, but with so many of these large ones using this software, they kind of have a disproportionate impact on how rents rise within the country at large, right? So even like a smaller sort of landlord, smaller one unit building, they'll just see, well, all these other buildings are, shooting up in price. So, maybe I'm not going to do 15% increase, but, maybe 7%, maybe 8%, maybe 10%, right? So it's having an impact throughout the industry at large. That is then causing, people who are renting, which again is there are luxury apartments where people who are more well off pay for it, but also disproportionately impacts people with less money, who can't afford that, and then therefore you see eviction rates shoot up because, I could barely afford $750 a month, and now my landlord wants $1,200 or wants $1,000, right? So it's it'll be really interesting to see how this lawsuit plays out. I don't know of another. I do know there was actually an example of another sort of price fixing scheme that did cause the industry to have to basically remove it. It was basically happened in the 90s, I believe, through the airline industry. They were using similar software to sort of, again, collude without directly talking to each other, airline prices. And they were found guilty, or whatever level of guilty, probably without saying guilty, that they were price fixing. And so there seems to be some parallels here. I'm going to be very curious to see how this one plays out. But, if you go back, 50 years, 60 years, maybe even 20 or 30 years ago, renting was it was very much a people business, right? You would meet your landlord. And this type of software has removed that element. And I think that's had unforeseen circumstances on the rental market at large, to the detrimental effects.
I thought I'm going to build on this a little bit by just looking at the way that rent has increased over time over the last 50 or 60 years. So if you go back between the 1960s and the 1970s, rent really rises pretty dramatically at that time.
Mm-hmm.
In the 1970s, we had this period of stagflation, which is when you have high inflation, but also a decline in the economy and high unemployment. So it's sort of the worst of all the worlds. And so housing prices and rent prices were affected by this. There was a major recession in the 1980s. In the 1990s, there's recovery from the recession. The housing market is up, but median household income starts to drop. So the prices are going up and people's ability to afford houses and rent starts to decline. In the early 2000s, we just talked about this sort of loose lending policies with some prime mortgages that leads to the housing bust. And medium incomes don't really reach to where they were in the early 1990s until the end of the 2000s. In 2010, we have economic recovery for, overall on average. It doesn't describe everybody's situation. Medium household income starts to rise again, but house prices and rents are starting to rise too. And then if we get into the last several years, if we look at the period from 2019 to 2021, so just before the pandemic, into the pandemic, median monthly rent across the United States rose 12%, while overall inflation rose at 6%. So the price of renting was double the price of inflation for other things.
Far outpaced it, yeah.
And this, of course, there's a geography to this. And in some cities, the increase was higher than other places. The city with the highest increase was Atlanta. And the other big increases with some of the highest rates, I think Atlanta was around 18% or something. I mean, this is on average, right?
Yeah.
And so other increases in places like Phoenix, Boston, Dallas, Chicago, and Houston were very high. Now, some places already had really high rents. And so they increased. It didn't look like that much from a percentage standpoint. But from this period from 2019 to 2021, the cities with the highest median rent prices in the United States were San Francisco, followed by Los Angeles, Washington, D.C., Boston, New York, and then Seattle. And so, they didn't get the most increase by percentage, but it went up in price, and they're already at very high levels. Now, of course, there's another aspect to this, which is that this is something that is disproportionately affecting African American and Latino people.
Right.
And so there is this ethnic racial component to this analysis as well. If we look at the all U.S. households, renters account for roughly 1/3 of them. Which,
right.
But then there's a disproportionately young people, Black and Latino people are left out of that. And so Black and Hispanic people make up 12 and 19% of the population, but 21% of renters. And so
which doesn't
much
surprise
higher
me.
percentage renting than their percentage of the population, in other words,
right,
particularly for African Americans.
Yeah, and I mean, and you brought up Atlanta as the most the highest increase. And Atlanta has a disproportionate amount of Black people living in
That's
it.
right.
So there's going to be a large,
not disproportionate, but a higher proportion.
In this case, proportion. Yeah. And so, yeah, it's really interesting to see the geography of rental increases and how that's impacting, especially these markets that historically have continued to be, if we're looking at the West Coast, for example, West Coast kind of got, even more particular, the West Coast of California, more expensive pretty a little while ago, right? We're talking now back into the mid 2000s probably. LA, I feel like, has been expensive for a long time as well. But now it's starting to trickle into these other cities that have historically, always been considered to be relatively affordable, right? Your Boise's, your Phoenixes, your Vegas's, your Atlantas, all these cities that are now, you're no longer, now it's your turn. Now you're going to be increasing. And I think a lot of this has to do with this new concept of, housing as an investment, right? These big companies, being enabled by things like this YieldStar software, are seeing the advantage of, okay, well, let's, buy apartments, let's, build apartments sometimes, but let's buy apartments as an investment firm, and let's maximize profits. And they see the path to that. They can get at it. They can, afford it. You have a quote here from The Atlantic, and it was just quote, over the past several years, and this is talking about a company called Blackstone Group, over the past several years, the company has been steadily acquiring a portfolio totaling of more than 40,000 apartments across some of the country's tightest, costliest housing markets, including California and the Boston and Washington, D.C. metro areas, right? So this is an investment group that, as of a few years ago, wasn't really in this market at all. Now they've gone and acquired over 40,000. I believe this is from maybe earlier this year. So it's probably more than that, over 40,000 apartments. And so it's seen as a way to generate steady incomes for shareholders. And again, this is coming on the backs of often people who can't afford it. Housing, I think if we look back at sort of like the necessities to actually live as a human being, right? You need water, you need food, and you need shelter. And all those things have a price attached to it. Shelter is by far getting costlier to the point where people aren't able to afford it anymore. And that's really unfortunate. And that's sort of, I think now this kind of like leads us into sort of our what ifs. And in fact, actually, but before we do that, let's do another ad break real quick.
Okay, let's take a break. And
then we're going to end on some what ifs. Here we go. All right, we are back and we are finally going to get to our what ifs. And I always think it's funny. We spend so much time talking about a subject and then not too much time talking about the what ifs. But that's okay. I don't know. I just think it works better that way.
I think a lot of the what if stuff is already sort of embedded in some of the earlier.
It is. It really is.
So this sort of is a distillation of that stuff and pulling out the things that we talked about and putting it squarely under the label of, well, what if?
Well, what if? So I'm going to throw a what if at you, Hunter, and maybe you can help distill that a little bit. So
okay,
we talked a little bit about sort of the geography of rents and housing affordability, right? So it's like largely focused, I would say today, largely focused on the West Coast. And so I guess my first question to you is, well, if rent and housing affordability wasn't so expensive anywhere in the country, how would that change the dynamic of sort of historically affordable Midwest cities versus West Coast cities or East Coast cities or Northeast cities?
I didn't see that one coming. Okay.
I guess I can help maybe get it started. Is that, or maybe just filter in some additional ideas, is that, because I think about this a lot of, right. So you have almost a geography of people moving to less expensive cities, right? So I think in the past couple of years, certainly, let's take Boise, Idaho as an example. Boise has always historically been a smaller city, pretty affordable. In fact, I would say up until about 2018, it was still pretty dang affordable. I think, maybe a Boisean might disagree a little bit about when that might actually happen, but I think they would still attest to the fact that especially since the pandemic, it has gotten a lot more expensive. And I think a large part of that is, well, California, Portland, Seattle are just far too expensive, right? If you have any hope of pursuing this dream of, this American dream of owning your own home, it can't be in these cities anymore because people are priced out, right? A new professional, say a 24-year-old hitting the market for the first time, gets their first job in Seattle, even working at a company like Amazon, and say they're making $80,000 a year, which by all means, great salary. You're not buying a house in Seattle on $80,000 a year, right?
Certainly not. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think, what you're pointing to is that we would see a different dynamic of migration in the country if housing was more affordable, because part of what's drawing people, and particularly maybe younger people, as you're pointing out, to cities like Boise in different areas or different regions of the country, is the fact that certain cities have become too expensive to buy a place in, or to rent in, or to live in. And so we would see a different, so on the national level, you'd see a different kind of migration happening. And then on more of an urban level, I think you would see a more diverse neighborhoods in many different ways. So there would be more diversity in terms of economics, right? Economic class or income. People of more different incomes might have more of an ability to live together in the same neighborhood if rents were lower. Um, Based on the segregation we've been talking about, based on race and ethnicity and these kinds of things, that would also probably be different. And there'd be a more diverse set of neighborhoods in many cities than we currently have. And many cities have some very stark segregation still to this day based on all this historical stuff we're talking about. So those would be some really big changes, I think, that if rent weren't so high.
Yeah. And I think, wow, I mean, that's a good one, I think. And I didn't even really think about that. But so we know, based on a lot of studies that have happened, that diverse neighborhoods, what have you, diverse neighborhoods are generally, by and large, more economically bountiful, more community driven, more, and people who live in them are generally happier. We know that. Studies have shown that segregated communities, whether they're self-segregated or purposely segregated, they're just not as functioning as well. And I think, certainly to your point, if rents weren't so high, this has impacted disproportionately people who are, people of color, right? Hispanic people, Black people, anybody who is generally not still, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. Maybe we could drop the Protestant at this point. I'm not sure how prevalent that is, but that same demographic, anybody who's not that has, definitely being likely disproportionately impacted as a group. And therefore, if rents weren't so high, and communities weren't able to be flushed with a bunch of money, and then people finding them valuable, and now all of a sudden people want to move there, those populations could stay, they would probably not have had as much gentrification, or I guess gentrification is usually the catch-all term for it. Really, it's displacement, right? When an entire community is sort of displaced in order to make room for this wealthier demographic that can afford these new prices based on the desirability of that neighborhood. Which is a really interesting concept.
If a lot of these things that we've talked about over this episode and the last one that have led to these high rents, if some of those had played out differently, which would be resulting in lower rents, then you would have also different groups, people of color, who would have more capital and would have, over generations would have more capital. And the situation economically for a lot of groups might be better. It would be pretty easy to argue if the rents were lower as well, because the poor, for example, spend a disproportionate amount of their incomes on housing. And if that were less true, then maybe they'll spend more of their incomes on other things, including potentially investments.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's another thing that would be different. Another thing that would be different, and we didn't talk about this because this is its own topic, but there would be less homelessness if rents were more affordable. And that's that's a phenomenon that deserves its own sort of attention, and that's why we didn't really go into it. But certainly, we bring that in the conversation at this point. That's another thing that would be different.
Right. I mean, I think it goes without saying, and we're not trying to ignore homelessness, but I think to your point, Hunter, it's its own topic that really needs its own episodes for us to do it justice. But to your point, yes, absolutely. If housing wasn't so expensive, if rent wasn't so expensive, we certainly wouldn't see the amount of homelessness that we do today. I think full stop, that's an easy one. There's a direct correlation there.
And another way in which neighborhoods would be more diverse would be there would be more diversity of housing type, as we've talked about. So the single family house, and Portland's okay on this in some areas where you do find single family homes and duplexes and triplexes and maybe a small apartment building. In some neighborhoods, you see that, and you would see probably more of that. So that's another thing that would be different. And what that means is that you would probably find at least slightly increased density in a lot of neighborhoods if that were the case.
Yeah, in some ways, answering this question of, well, what if rents weren't so high, or what if housing wasn't so expensive, is almost, that's almost the answer to other questions, right? Well, it's, what if our cities were denser and had, more types of housing available and had built it up over the last 100 years instead of single family housing? Well, therefore, it probably wouldn't be as expensive to live.
That's right. That's right.
But I absolutely agree with you. I think if rents weren't so high, it's likely because of the fact that there's simply more housing available and different kinds of housing, right? We often think of, people as, if you look at the standard American dream, it's like people want to own their single family house. And there's a lot of people who do want that. And, to a degree, I'm okay with that. I'm living in a single family house right now. There's also a lot of people who are perfectly fine owning something different, a condo, an apartment. They're fine with owning a townhouse. They're fine with owning a row house. They're fine with owning one half of a duplex. And I think a lot of the discussion around affordability comes into, well, we're giving people two polar ends here. You either live in an apartment, usually on a busy street, major arterial, what have you, within a city, or they buy, or maybe you rent a house that are, a single family detached house. And there's just so much wealth of in between that's being just sort of dropped out, and we're not talking about. And so, and so I think that's a major aspect of this. It has to be.
Another thing that picks up on something we talked about just minutes ago in the podcast was, you mentioned how all these investment groups are starting to buy up housing throughout the country. And if rents weren't so high, they wouldn't be motivated to do that. And you would have fewer large companies increasisingly controlling the housing market. And that's another thing that would be different, I think.
I think because I've thought a little bit about this, because, obviously, and this is an argument that a lot of people like to go to, is like, well, if you implement any sort of regulations, then the market's going to dry up and then we're left with even less housing. And I think where I usually go with that is, okay, but, housing hasn't always been as expensive as it is today. And really what it is it's just changed the market. It's changed the way that these companies make their money, right? So if you go back to, even just a few decades ago, it wasn't uncommon for a company to build multifamily housing. And then the way that they were going to make their money is they were going to sell each individual unit. They were going to make condos, right? So you're going to have multifamily condos and sort of like build the building for $50 million. And it's, 100 units, and you're going to sell each one for whatever. And by the end of it, you're going to make your 5 or 10% profit and, move on to the next, right? And that has sort of been switched to now where investment companies don't want to make a one-off profit, right? This is like the Netflix model. It's the subscription model, right? That we see it's ever pervasive within our capitalist society of, no, you need to have resource extraction every single month, right? This needs to be an ongoing, indefinite amount of return on income. So that's, you're always making your money back. And I think, had these investment companies, so if rent wasn't so expensive, these investment companies likely wouldn't be as interested, but I think we would have a similar type of company that would still exist, where, their end goal is just to make their 5 to 10% profits, turn it over to, the new owners, the people who live there, and move on. Now they're going to build another one somewhere, and they're just going to keep repeating that process.
Well, another thing that relates to this conversation is the idea that in the United States in particular, one of the ways that people think about investment is with property, right? With owning a house is not only owning a house, but it's an investment for your retirement and this kind of thing. And if rents were lower, there would be less motivation to become a landlord in some ways, and that real estate would not be as strong a factor in the way that people invest, and investments would maybe be, people would be investing in higher percentages in other things, perhaps. Mm-hmm. And so the way that people think about retirement, the way that people think about investments in private property might be a bit different if rents weren't so high.
Right. If there wasn't that expectation of, well, we need to make, money back on this. This needs to pay for things down the road, right?
Or as much,
Or as
for
much. Yeah.
example, right? That you
Yeah.
wouldn't expect the kind of margins that maybe people have come to expect. Um,
Well,
Another thing that relates to our conversation, I think that might be different if rents weren't so high, is that maybe, again, this would have to do with the way that things evolved over time,
mhm.
but maybe the way that public transportation developed in the country would be a little bit different as well. And we talked a lot about single family homes and the automobile, and how the automobile has become this sort of this privileged thing in the United States vis-a-vis a lot of other places. And cars would still be important, people would still want them, but maybe public transportation would have played out or endured, or maybe be a little bit different if rents weren't so high as well.
Yeah, because I think going back to, if rents weren't so high, that probably predicated on the fact that, we live in denser areas. Cities um, would have evolved. I would argue probably a little more naturally, wherein, as more people are moving into an area, it's going to naturally densify. The market's going to build, whatever, and therefore, there's a pretty hard equation where it's like, once you have this amount of density, your transit line becomes sort of, quote unquote profitable. It becomes viable for use. Whereas, most of your cities, transit lines probably aren't viable because they are swimming in a sea of low density housing that there's just not enough people to really enable it. Whereas you go to, someplace like Berlin, and obviously they have public transit everywhere. They have cars, people drive cars all over Berlin. But they also have that density, right? So that, public transit and the frequency of that transit becomes really high. The use becomes very high. As the use comes higher, there's more trains, there's more public transit, right? So it's like this cascading effect, and you just can't ever hit that when you're in a literal sea of, cul-de-sacs and large lot single family houses, like most of our suburbs are, and much of our inner cities are too, including, here in Portland. But let's flip this a little bit. So we talked a lot about rent control, right? And so what I guess the way I would want to flip it is, well, what if rent control was everywhere? What if, if we go back to that, was it 1942 law that passed as part of the wartime act, to establish rent control? And we talked about how every single major city, aside from Scranton, Pennsylvania, had enacted rent control. Well, what if that persisted well into the decades that followed, right? As we know, based on history, most cities have done away with it. In fact, really, we only really hear about it in the context of New York City at this point. What would that have done? How would that have impacted cities? And that's actually a question I'm not sure I can even answer, because it's pretty. I think there's a lot of impacts that go into that.
Well, I mean, I think we maybe touched on a little bit of people's attitudes towards private property as an investment, and what the expectation of the role of government in housing would be different, right? There would be more of an expectation that the government does have a role to play in, ensuring that there's affordable housing, maybe building housing, and, not the sort of monolithic stuff that we talked about in the 60s and 70s, which proved to be unlivable. But maybe, there's a model where we developing housing that is more livable, and that people have more of a view towards the government as that's something that they should provide. And so maybe there would be different attitudes towards what the role of government in the United States should be vis-a-vis housing. And, not that it would replicate what's in Europe or Japan or some other place in the world, but that it might be a little bit different than it is now.
Right. I mean, it's like, to your point, I think there's a likelihood that that's almost like a cultural shift, right? Because I think if that cultural shift happens, I think, and people are looking, we've had decades now, and I would say it's only been like fairly recently that we're starting to go back the other way, but we've had decades now where people generally, regardless of what spectrum they are on, Democrat or Republican, still favor deregulation and sort of, big government staying out of the way of things. However, had rent control continued to be a thing, and people sort of that cultural shift started happening where, okay, people expected the federal government to have some sort of role in sort of their everyday life, right? That's a very everyday life situation. That's a cultural shift that I think bleeds over into a lot of other areas where people expect not just for the federal government to have a hand in that, but maybe in other things too, right? Maybe
Well,
yeah.
The U.S. government has a pretty big role in subsidizing agriculture, for example.
Mm-hmm.
That doesn't often get talked about by people who are saying, well, the government should not have a very big role in things. Well, they do have a role in certain things, and sometimes those things get glossed over. So, it might just be it might be a cultural shift, but it also might be a shift in what we think that is reasonable for the U.S. government to be subsidizing.
Mm-hmm.
What the U.S. government spends money on.
Right.
That maybe there'd be some reexamination of those kinds of things too, because if you want to have more public housing, those kinds of things, you have to use more public revenue, which means either more taxes or a shift in priorities of spending. And so that would have to be part of the shift in mentality as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, right. I mean, so like, as a country, we spend a lot on sort of defense, right? So, is that still prioritized? We spend a lot on, you brought up agricultural, what's the bill called? Like Cotton Bill, something like that. It usually has the same name. It's like every year, it just sort of, it's like $1 trillion that sort of like funnels out to various subsidies of corn.
Right. And not to
things.
say that that's right or wrong, but if can happen, then other things could be subsidized as well. And so this idea that, no, we can't subsidize anything, and that's not happening actually.
Right.
There's all kinds of ways in which, there's subsidies for various, corporate initiatives and these kinds of things, and those exist. And so this would be one more, perhaps, and that would be a change.
Right. And I think the other big part of like thing that maybe this filters into is like, okay, well, if the government has such a hand in, subsidizing rents and all this kind of stuff, does, the other big thing that people deal with almost daily is, well, what about healthcare, right? Which is another, very deregulated industry that we as a country very purposefully did in sort of, I don't know, probably starting in the 50s and 60s to really start that process to get to where we are today. And honestly, that's a whole other episode.
that is another episode. There's a lot to say about that.
There's a lot to say about that. I think broad-based, the what ifs here are, our cities would probably look and feel very different because in order to get things affordable again, does require a different way that certainly a lot of our cities are interacting, a lot of our suburbs are interacting with, right? The single family home model is great for some people, but it can't just be the only thing that we're offering. And right now we're about, it's probably like a 90-10 split, and it needs to be more even than that. No. And I think that's it. Do we have anything else?
I think we're wrapping it up.
Yeah. This has been a really fun episode for me. I love talking about cities. Funds in quotes here, right? It's, we're all impacted by housing affordability.
Right. Yeah. Fun doesn't mean lighthearted, but it's been interesting. To talk about something that has so many moving parts, that has so many historical elements that has resulted to where we are. And, it's, a lot of people in dire situations. That's not the fun part, but it is interesting to talk about how we've gotten here and what could be different.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. And so I think with that, we'll let you go. It's probably been, I don't know how long this is actually going to be. I guess this is probably going to be almost close to 3 hours of episodes.
If you put the two together.
The two together. Yeah. On housing. Next time we are going to talk a little bit about some high-speed rail, and it's another nerdy subject for me that I'm really looking forward to. If you watch my YouTube channel at all, you'll probably know that.
Get primed.
Yeah. So with that, Hunter, kick us off with some pluggables.
So I'm Hunter Shoby. I'm a professor of geography at Portland State University. co-author with David Banis of Portland a Cultural Atlas and Upper Left Cities, a Cultural Atlas of San Francisco, Portland, and Seattle.
Yeah. And my name is Jeff Gibson. I run a YouTube channel, youtube.com/@ geography by Jeff. That's GEOFF. You can find me on Substack as well, geographybyjeff.substack.com, or on Instagram, instagram.com/geography by Jeff. At this point, you can probably just Google Geography by Jeff and get all of those different things if you want. We also leave those kinds of links inside our show notes now, so feel free to click on those if you have access to that. But otherwise, it's been a pleasure going over this. Hopefully you learned a lot, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks for listening.